I sat in my car, staring at the dimly lit driveway of my house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine hummed softly, but I couldn't bring myself to cut it. Going inside meant stepping back into the same life that had become suffocatingly familiar. A house that felt colder than the January air outside, a wife who slept in the same bed but felt like a stranger, and a marriage I no longer knew how to fix. Her betrayal still lingered in the corners of my mind, even though it had happened 5 years ago. I had forgiven her, or so I thought. We had agreed to move past it, for the sake of our family and the life we'd built together. But forgiveness, I realized, wasn't the same as forgetting. The memory of her confession was like an unhealed wound, reopened every time she looked at me with those apologetic eyes, every time she reached out with affection that felt forced. "Dylan," she had said back then, her voice cracking, "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." It didn't mean anything, but it had meant everything to me. I didn't yell, didn't throw things, didn't storm out of the house like I wanted to. Instead, I swallowed my pride, nodded, and told her we could work through it. Yet here I was, years later, still haunted by the ghost of that mistake. Inside the house, the lights were on in the living room. Laura was probably sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone or reading one of her mystery novels. She'd look up when I walked in, smile faintly, and ask how my day went. The same routine we'd followed for months now, each interaction a polite exchange between two people who no longer felt like partners. I sighed, finally turning the key to kill the engine, and grabbed my briefcase. My shoulders sagged as I trudged toward the front door. The truth was, I wasn't just tired of Laura, I was tired of everything. My job as an operations manager, which had once filled me with pride and purpose, now felt like an endless cycle of meetings and paperwork. My friends had faded into acquaintances, our weekly poker nights long replaced by the occasional text message. Even the small joys, like cooking a good meal or going for a run, had lost their spark. As I pushed open the door, the warmth of the house did little to chase away the chill in my chest. Laura looked up from the couch, just as I'd predicted. "Hey," she said, her voice neutral. "How was work?" "Same as always," I replied, forcing a smile. "How about you?" She shrugged. "Quiet day. I made lasagna. It's in the fridge if you're hungry." "Thanks," I said, setting my briefcase down by the door. The silence that followed felt heavier than the air itself. I went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared at the neatly wrapped foil tray of lasagna without really seeing it. The fridge hummed softly, the only sound in the room. My stomach churned, but I wasn't hungry. What I felt was something deeper, something harder to ignore. A gnawing sense of emptiness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from Paul, a friend I hadn't seen in months. "Hey man, need a huge favor. Can you call me?" I furrowed my brow. Paul and I had drifted apart over the years, but he'd always been the guy to call when he needed something. With nothing better to do, I stepped out onto the back porch and dialed his number. "Dylan, thanks for calling back," Paul said, his voice too enthusiastic. "I owe you one already. What's up?" I asked, leaning against the wooden railing and gazing out at the dark yard. "So, I've got a date tonight," he began, "but it's kind of a double date situation. Michelle, you remember her? Works in finance. She's bringing a friend, and I can't exactly leave her hanging. I was hoping you could, step in and keep the friend company." I sighed, already regretting picking up the call. "Paul, I don't know. I've had a long day. Come on, Dylan. You'd be doing me a huge favor. Besides, you could use a night out. Blow off some steam, talk to someone new. It's just dinner, no strings attached." I hesitated, the idea of spending my evening with strangers not exactly appealing. But then again, it wasn't like I had anything better waiting for me inside. "Fine," I said, surprising myself. "What's the plan?" Paul rattled off the details, thanking me profusely before hanging up. As I put my phone back in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. That night, as I stood in front of the mirror getting ready, I caught a glimpse of myself, tired eyes, a few more lines on my face than I remembered, and a tie that suddenly felt too tight. This wasn't who I used to be. Somewhere along the way, I had lost the spark, the part of me that felt alive. Maybe tonight would be pointless, I thought. Or maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something new. The restaurant Paul had chosen was one of those trendy places downtown, with exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and small, round tables packed too close together. The kind of place that screamed intimacy while charging too much for cocktails. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, the cold night air stinging my cheeks. As much as I wanted to turn back and crawl into bed, I reminded myself that I'd already committed. Paul was waiting just outside the entrance, nervously adjusting his collar. His hair, which was usually a chaotic mess, had been tamed into a respectable part. He looked more polished than I'd ever seen him, which told me just how much he cared about impressing Michelle. "There you are," Paul said, relief flooding his voice as he spotted me. "You're a lifesaver, man." "Really?" Yeah, I muttered, shoving my hands into my coat pockets. "Let's just get this over with." Paul laughed awkwardly, clearly ignoring my tone. "Don't be such a grouch. Michelle's friend is nice, I promise. You might even have fun." I doubted that, but I followed him inside anyway. The restaurant was bustling, waitstaff weaving between tables while couples leaned in close over candlelit meals. Paul scanned the room before nudging me. "They're here." I followed his gaze to a booth near the back. Michelle was hard to miss. She had that polished, effortlessly elegant look that drew attention without trying. Her black dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her dark hair cascaded in waves over her shoulders. She looked like she belonged in this kind of place. But it was the woman sitting next to her who caught my attention, and not for the reasons I expected. Stephanie. I knew her from the office. She worked in the tax department on the floor below mine, though you wouldn't guess it by how often people overlooked her. Stephanie was the quiet type, soft-spoken, shy, always keeping to herself. She dressed plainly, usually in oversized sweaters and long skirts, her hair falling in loose waves that half covered her face. I'd heard co-workers whisper about her, making cruel jokes that I never had the courage to shut down. But tonight, she was unrecognizable. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant bun, revealing sharp cheekbones and warm, amber eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. She wore a simple navy blue dress that hugged her in all the right places, and her makeup was subtle but flawless. For a moment, I thought Paul had gotten the wrong booth. Michelle greeted us with a radiant smile. "Paul, and this must be Dylan." "Guilty," I said, trying to shake the awkwardness from my voice. "Dylan, this is Stephanie," Michelle said, gesturing toward her friend. Stephanie gave me a shy smile, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "Hi, Dylan," she said softly. "Hi," I replied, unsure of what else to say. Paul and Michelle slid into the booth, immediately engrossed in their own conversation. That left Stephanie and me to awkwardly face each other. I gestured toward the open seat across from her. "Mind if I sit?" "Not at all," she said, her voice calm. As I sat down, I couldn't help but notice the small scar running from her temple to her cheekbone, something I'd never seen before. It wasn't large or disfiguring, but it was noticeable, a silver thread against her otherwise smooth skin. Oddly, it didn't detract from her appearance. If anything, it added an air of mystery. For the first few minutes, our conversation was halting. I asked how long she'd known Michelle. She asked how I knew Paul. Basic small talk, nothing remarkable. But then, something shifted. "So, how do you know Paul?" Stephanie asked, her voice carrying just a hint of curiosity. "We used to work on some projects together," I said. "Now, he mostly calls me when he needs a favor." Stephanie chuckled, a soft, melodic sound that caught me off guard. "That sounds like Paul." Her laugh was genuine, and it put me at ease. "What about you? How'd Michelle rope you into this?" "She didn't have to try very hard," Stephanie said, smiling. "It's not like I had other plans." "Hard to believe," I said before I could stop myself. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, a hint of surprise flickering across her face. "Why do you say that?" I hesitated, unsure how to recover. "I just mean, you seem interesting. I'm surprised you're not busy doing something more exciting." Stephanie tilted her head, studying me for a moment. Most people don't find me very interesting, she said, her tone light, but with an edge of something deeper. Well, maybe most people are idiots, I said, surprising both of us. Stephanie blinked, then smiled. A real, unguarded smile that lit up her face. I'll take that as a compliment. As the evening went on, I found myself drawn in by her. She told me about her love of soccer, her childhood trips to games with her dad, and her recent obsession with skydiving. Yes, skydiving. You? Skydiving? I asked, incredulous. 3 times, she said, laughing at my disbelief. It's an amazing feeling. You should try it. I think I'd need a lot more convincing, I said, shaking my head. Stephanie leaned forward, her amber eyes catching the candlelight. You'd be surprised what you can do when you let go of fear. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. Something I hadn't felt since long before Laura's betrayal, hope. By the time the appetizers arrived, the awkward tension between Stephanie and me had melted away. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but suddenly, our conversation wasn't just polite small talk. It was real, honest. She spoke with a quiet confidence that I hadn't noticed before, and every word drew me in further. So, skydiving, huh? I said, spearing a piece of bruschetta with my fork. What made you decide to jump out of a plane for fun? Stephanie grinned, her eyes lighting up. It wasn't as dramatic as you're probably imagining. My friend convinced me to try it for her birthday. I was terrified, but once I was up there, looking down at the world from so high up, something clicked. I felt free, like nothing else mattered. After that, I couldn't stop. 3 times, though? I shook my head in disbelief. That's not just trying something once for a friend. That's full-on daredevil territory. She laughed, a warm, melodic sound that made me forget the dull ache I'd carried in my chest all day. I guess I've always liked a challenge, she said, her tone softening. When life throws something at you, you can either run from it or face it head-on. I try to choose the latter. Her words struck a chord. For years, I'd been running from Laura's betrayal, from my own unhappiness, from the life I no longer recognized. I glanced at Stephanie, her gaze steady and unflinching, and felt a strange mix of admiration and envy. What about you? She asked, tilting her head. Ever done anything crazy like that? Not even close, I admitted. My idea of living on the edge is skipping my morning coffee. Stephanie smirked. Maybe it's time to change that. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't just the suggestion of trying something new. It was the way she said it, like she genuinely believed I could. Like I wasn't just another worn-down guy stuck in a dead-end marriage and an uninspired routine. I shifted the conversation, not quite ready to delve into my own shortcomings. So, how did you get into tax work? Doesn't exactly scream thrill seeker. Stephanie chuckled, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Fair point. It's not the most exciting field, but I like numbers. They make sense. They don't lie or cheat, and they don't change their minds halfway through. The way she said it made me wonder if she was talking about more than just her job. I didn't press her, though. What about you? She asked. I know you're in operations, but what made you choose that? I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. Why had I chosen it? Once, I would have had an answer. A genuine passion for problem solving, a love of seeing a plan come together. But now? Now it felt like just another box I checked every day. Something to get me from 9 to 5 without falling apart. I used to love it, I said finally, surprising myself with my honesty. But somewhere along the way, it started feeling more like going through the motions. You know? Stephanie nodded, her expression thoughtful. Yeah, I get that. It's easy to lose sight of why we started something in the first place. Her words hit harder than they should have, and I looked away, suddenly uncomfortable under her gaze. She wasn't saying it to judge me. She was just being honest. But honesty had a way of cutting deeper than I expected. As the night went on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, favorite movies, embarrassing childhood stories, and a shared love of terrible diner coffee. By the time dessert arrived, I was laughing more than I had in months. You're not what I expected, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Stephanie raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? I don't know, I admitted. At work, you're so reserved. Quiet. But here, you're completely different. Stephanie's smile faltered for a moment, and she looked down at her hands. Work isn't exactly the easiest place to be myself, she said quietly. People see the limp, the scar, and they think they know me. It's easier to stay invisible than to deal with the stares. Her words made my chest tighten. I'd seen those stares. Hell, I'd probably been one of them, even if I'd never meant to. I'm sorry, I said, my voice low. You shouldn't have to deal with that. Stephanie looked up, her eyes soft. Thanks, Dylan. That means a lot. The moment lingered between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was really seeing someone. Not just the surface, but the person underneath. As we finished our drinks and the night wound down, Paul and Michelle reappeared, their laughter breaking the spell. Ready to go? Paul asked, looking between us with a knowing grin. Stephanie glanced at me, her eyes asking a silent question. I think we'll stay a little longer, I said, surprising myself. Paul gave me a thumbs up before leaving with Michelle, and suddenly, it was just the two of us again. Thanks for tonight, Stephanie said, her voice soft. I didn't expect to have this much fun. Neither did I admitted. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I meant it. By the time we finally stepped out of the restaurant, the air had turned colder, the city streets quieter. Stephanie hugged her coat tightly around her, and I instinctively moved closer, offering her some warmth from my presence, if not my jacket. I still wasn't sure what tonight had been, but one thing was clear. It had been different. A good different. We walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, the sound of our footsteps against the pavement filling the gaps where words didn't need to be. It wasn't until we reached a small park, its benches illuminated by a faint glow from the streetlights, that Stephanie paused and turned to me. Thanks for not making tonight awkward, she said with a small smile. I wasn't exactly excited about being set up. I chuckled, shoving my hands into my pockets. To be honest, neither was I. Paul practically dragged me into it. But I'm glad I came. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. Instead, she gestured toward a bench. Do you mind sitting for a bit? I don't feel like going home yet. Not at all, I said, following her to the bench. I sat down beside her, leaving just enough space to be polite, though part of me wanted to close the gap. The night had a strange kind of quiet to it. Not the emptiness of silence, but the peaceful kind that felt like the world was finally taking a breath. Stephanie stared at the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her coat. There's something I didn't tell you earlier, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. About the scar. And the limp. You don't have to, I started, but she shook her head, cutting me off. I want to, she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. It's part of who I am. And after tonight, I feel like you deserve to know. I stayed quiet, giving her the space to speak. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on a distant point across the park. When I was 10, I was riding my bike near our house. It was a quiet street, one of those places where nothing bad ever happens, you know? But that day, her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. That day, a car came out of nowhere. The driver wasn't paying attention. He didn't even see me. I swallowed hard, already sensing where this was going. It hit me, she continued, her tone steady but distant, as if she were recounting someone else's story. The impact shattered my leg, and the doctors couldn't save it. They had to amputate below the knee. She paused, glancing at me as if to gauge my reaction. When she saw no pity or judgment, she went on. The scar on my face came from the same accident. I hit the pavement hard, and the glass from my bike's headlight cut me. I didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate, like they couldn't possibly carry the weight of what she just shared. But Stephanie didn't seem to need words. She needed someone to listen. It took me years to come to terms with it, she admitted. I hid behind my hair, my clothes, my silence. I let myself believe that the world only saw the scar and the limp, that they didn't see me. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for the first time, I realized just how much strength it must have taken for her to tell me this. But they're wrong, I said softly, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. You're more than that. You're strong, smart, and, honestly, kind of incredible. Stephanie blinked, clearly caught off guard. You really think that? I know it, I said, meeting her gaze. Everything you've been through, and you're still standing. You're still living. That's incredible. For a moment, she looked like she didn't know how to respond. Then, a small, genuine smile broke across her face. Thank you, Dylan. That means more than you know. We sat there for a while longer, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. She told me about the first time she tried to run with her prosthetic leg, how she'd fallen flat on her face but laughed anyway. I told her about my disastrous attempt at hiking last year, where I'd gotten lost for hours and ended up calling Paul for help. The more we talked, the more I realized how easy it was to be around her. There were no pretenses, no masks. Just two people, sitting on a park bench, sharing pieces of themselves they kept hidden from the rest of the world. Eventually, the cold began to creep into my bones, and I noticed Stephanie shivering slightly. I should get you home, I said, standing up and offering her my hand. She took it, her fingers warm against mine. Thanks, Dylan, for everything. I walked her to her car, and as she opened the door, she hesitated. Would it be okay if we did this again sometime? Just talking, I smiled, a real one that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd like that. She gave me one last smile before getting into her car and driving off, leaving me standing on the curb with a strange, unfamiliar feeling in my chest. For the first time in years, it felt like a door had cracked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk through it. The next morning, I walked into the office with an unfamiliar sense of ease. For years, I dragged myself through the hallways like a ghost, barely present, counting down the hours until I could leave. But today felt different. The memory of my conversation with Stephanie lingered in the back of my mind, like a warm ember refusing to burn out. When I reached my desk, Paul was already waiting for me, perched on the edge of the cubicle wall with his trademark mischievous grin. Well? He asked, leaning in conspiratorially. How'd it go? How'd what go? I replied, feigning confusion. Paul rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, Dylan. Don't play dumb. You and Stephanie were looking pretty cozy last night. Michelle told me she's never seen Steph so relaxed. I shrugged, though I couldn't help the small smile that crept onto my face. She's different from what I expected. Different in a good way? Paul pressed. Yeah, I admitted. In a good way. Paul clapped me on the shoulder, his grin widening. I knew it. You're welcome, by the way. I expect full credit in your wedding speech. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, I said, shaking my head. But even as I said it, I couldn't deny that something about last night had shifted the way I saw the world, or at least, the way I saw Stephanie. The morning passed in a blur of emails and meetings, my thoughts drifting back to our conversation at the park. Her strength, her honesty, her refusal to let her past define her. It all stood in stark contrast to the life I'd been living. Where I had chosen to hide behind a mask of apathy, Stephanie had chosen to face the world head-on. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wanted to do the same. But then, just as I was settling into a rare moment of peace, everything changed. It started with a whisper, a low, hushed murmur that rippled through the office like a shockwave. I glanced up from my desk, noticing the way heads turned toward the same point in the room, the break area where Stephanie stood. Her back turned as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She didn't seem to notice the stares, or if she did, she was doing a damn good job of pretending she didn't. Curious, I leaned over my desk toward Claire, a coworker in the cubicle across from mine. What's going on? You haven't seen it yet? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly before turning the screen toward me. It was a photo, a blurry, poorly lit shot of Stephanie from the night before, sitting across from me at the restaurant. Her scar and prosthetic were on full display, though neither detail was the focus of the picture. No, what stood out was the cruel caption written underneath. The company's charity case finds a date. Who knew? My stomach dropped. Where did this come from? I asked, my voice low and tense. Someone in marketing posted it on the office chat, Claire said, looking uncomfortable. It's been making the rounds all morning. I clenched my jaw, my pulse pounding in my ears. Stephanie had shared more of herself with me last night than she probably had with anyone in years, and now some faceless coward had turned her vulnerability into a joke. It made my blood boil. Pushing back from my desk, I stood and made my way toward the break area. Stephanie was still there, her coffee in hand, her gaze focused on something outside the window. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her, but then I saw it, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself a little too still. She knew. Stephanie, I said softly, stepping into her line of sight. She turned to face me, her expression calm but guarded. Hey, Dylan. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't need me to tell her about the photo. She didn't need my pity or my outrage. What she needed was my support. I saw the photo, I said finally, my voice low. I'm so sorry. Stephanie gave a small, humorless laugh. Don't be. It's not the first time something like this has happened. That doesn't make it okay, I said firmly. You don't deserve this. She shrugged, her eyes dropping to the floor. People see what they want to see, and some of them only want to see the worst. Then they're idiots, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. They don't know you, Stephanie. They don't know half of what you've been through, or what you've accomplished. Don't let them take that away from you. Her gaze lifted, meeting mine. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or hope. But then she smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. Thanks, Dylan. Really. But I've dealt with worse. I wanted to say more, to tell her that she didn't have to deal with it alone. But before I could, she turned and walked back toward her desk. I watched her go, my fists clenching at my sides. By lunchtime, the photo had been taken down, likely by HR, but the damage was already done. The whispers hadn't stopped, and neither had the sideways glances. But as I sat at my desk, stewing in my anger, an idea began to take shape in my mind. A way to show everyone just how wrong they were about Stephanie. And this time, I wasn't going to sit back and let the moment pass. That evening, as I drove home, my mind churned with frustration. The image of Stephanie standing in the break room, pretending not to care, haunted me. I replayed her words in my head. I've dealt with worse. She had said it with such quiet resignation, but it didn't sit right with me. Why should she have to deal with any of it? Why was the burden always hers to carry? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made up my mind. If the office wanted to talk about Stephanie, then I'd give them something worth talking about. She deserved better than whispers and cruel jokes behind her back. She deserved respect. And if they couldn't see that on their own, I'd make them see it. The next morning, I walked into work with a renewed sense of purpose. My first stop was HR. Good morning, Dylan, said Monica, the head of the department, without looking up from her desk. What can I do for you? I want to report workplace harassment, I said bluntly, and that made her pause. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Harassment? About what? I placed my phone on her desk, pulling up the screenshot Claire had shown me the day before. This was posted on the office chat yesterday. It's a direct attack on one of our coworkers, Stephanie. Monica's expression hardened as she leaned forward to examine the image. This is unacceptable, she said after a moment. Do you know who posted it? Not yet, I admitted, but I want it investigated. Someone in marketing uploaded it, and I'm sure IT can trace it back to the source. Monica nodded, already making notes. Leave this with me. I'll make sure it's handled. Thank you, I said, my voice firm. But that's not all I'm here for. She looked up again, curious. What else? I want to organize a presentation, I said. Something to highlight Stephanie's achievements, not just at work, but in life. People need to see who she really is, not the version they've made up in their heads. Monica tilted her head, studying me for a moment. That's an unusual request, Dylan. I know, I said, meeting her gaze. But it's the right thing to do. She was quiet for a beat, then nodded. All right. If Stephanie consents, we can arrange something. That was the easy part. The hard part was convincing Stephanie. When I approached her desk later that morning, she looked up with a weary expression, like she was bracing herself for another awkward apology. Hey, I said, leaning against the partition. Do you have a minute? Sure, she said, though her tone was cautious. Let's take a walk, I suggested, gesturing toward the hallway. She hesitated but eventually stood, grabbing her cane and following me out of the office. We walked in silence for a bit, the sound of her cane tapping against the floor the only noise between us. Finally, I stopped near the large windows overlooking the city. I went to HR this morning, I began, watching her reaction carefully. Stephanie frowned. Why? To report the photo, I said, and to do something about the way people treat you. She sighed, shaking her head. Dylan, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I said, cutting her off. Because it's not just about the photo. It's about the way they look at you, the way they talk about you when they think you're not listening. It's wrong, Stephanie, and I can't stand by and watch it anymore. Her gaze softened, but there was still doubt in her eyes. You can't change the way people think. Maybe not, I said, but I can show them the truth. I talked to Monica about organizing a presentation, something that highlights everything you've accomplished, your marathons, your skydiving, your work here. People need to see you for who you really are. Stephanie blinked, clearly taken aback. You want to do that for me? I want to do it with you, I said. Only if you're comfortable, of course. She stared at me for a long moment, her amber eyes searching mine. Finally, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. Okay, she said softly. Let's do it. Over the next week, we worked together to pull everything together. Stephanie was reluctant at first, but as we combed through photos of her marathons, videos of her skydiving, and stories of her travels, I saw her confidence grow. She started to open up more, sharing stories that even I hadn't heard before. On the day of the presentation, the entire office gathered in the main conference room. Stephanie stood at the front of the room, her shoulders squared, her chin held high. As she spoke about her journey, the accident, the challenges, the triumphs, I saw the way people's expressions changed. The judgment and indifference melted away, replaced by awe and admiration. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Stephanie's cheeks flushed as she stepped back from the podium, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. You were amazing, I told her as we left the room. She glanced at me, her smile wide and genuine. I couldn't have done it without you. Yeah, you could have, I said. You just didn't know it yet. For the first time, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something real. Stephanie had faced the world head-on, and in doing so, she'd inspired me to stop running from my own life. But little did I know, the ripple effect of this day would go far beyond anything either of us had imagined. The weeks following the presentation were like watching a sunrise after a long, sleepless night. Stephanie's presence in the office transformed. The quiet, withdrawn woman I'd known was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with confidence, someone who spoke up in meetings and greeted colleagues with an easy smile. People no longer whispered about her. They talked to her, really talked to her. The scar and limp that had once been the focus of cruel jokes now seemed invisible, eclipsed by the force of her personality. And me? I was changing too. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but somewhere between late-night planning sessions for the presentation and watching Stephanie light up the room with her story, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. The walls I'd built around myself, the ones I'd used to keep out the pain of Laura's betrayal, the monotony of my life, and the gnawing sense of failure, were starting to crumble. It wasn't just about Stephanie, though she was at the heart of it. It was about what she represented. Resilience, strength, and the courage to face life head-on. She made me want to be better, not just for her, but for myself. One crisp Friday evening, I found myself outside Stephanie's apartment, a small bouquet of sunflowers in my hand. She had mentioned once, in passing, how much she loved them because they always seemed to find the light, no matter how cloudy the sky. It felt fitting. When she opened the door, Her expression shifted from surprise to delight. "Dylan," she said, her voice soft. "What are you doing here?" I held out the flowers, feeling a little awkward. "I wanted to thank you," I said, "for reminding me what it feels like to care about something. About someone." Her cheeks flushed as she took the bouquet, her fingers brushing mine. "You didn't have to do this," she said, but her smile told me she was glad I had. "Can I come in?" I asked, suddenly nervous. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her apartment was warm and inviting, filled with small touches that spoke to who she was. Photos from her travels lined the walls, and a shelf by the window held books on everything from cooking to marathon training. It was a reflection of her, a mix of adventure, resilience, and quiet strength. We sat on her couch, the flowers resting in a vase she'd filled with water. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, I broke the silence. "Stephanie," I began, my voice unsteady. "I need to tell you something." She turned to me, her amber eyes full of curiosity. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. "When I met you, I was lost. Stuck in this cycle of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I was holding on to things that hurt me, my marriage, my regrets, my mistakes, because I didn't know how to let go. But then you came along, and you showed me what it looks like to face life with courage. You reminded me that it's never too late to start over." Her eyes softened, and she reached out, placing her hand over mine. "Dylan, I'm falling in love with you," I said, cutting her off. "And I know it's probably too soon, and I know I've got a lot of baggage to work through, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. You've changed everything for me." For a moment, Stephanie didn't say anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for her response, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Dylan," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "you're not the only one who's been holding back. I've been scared too, scared that what I feel for you isn't real, or that it's too good to be true. But the truth is, I'm falling for you too." Relief and joy washed over me in equal measure, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't perfect or polished. It was raw and real, filled with all the emotions we've been holding back. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. "You know," she said teasingly, "I wasn't expecting my life to change when Michelle dragged me out to dinner that night." "Me neither," I admitted, laughing. "But I'm glad it did." The weeks that followed felt like a second chance, not just at love, but at life. I finalized my divorce with Laura, letting go of the bitterness and resentment that had weighed me down for years. I started running again, finding solace in the rhythm of my feet pounding against the pavement. And with Stephanie by my side, I began to see the world through a different lens, one filled with possibility, not regret. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through the park where we'd first truly connected, Stephanie glanced up at me with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Think you're ready for that skydiving lesson yet?" she asked. I laughed, shaking my head. "Not even close." She smirked, leaning into me. "We'll see about that." And as I looked at her, this incredible, resilient woman who had walked into my life when I least expected it, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the future. With Stephanie, anything felt possible.